All right, thanks for coming to LatencyConf. We're starting a couple minutes late, but it's called LatencyConf. Who didn't expect that? Yeah, the jokes don't get better from here. Thanks for having me here to Australia. This is my first time here, and for someone who thinks entirely in cartoons, it's been transformative. I tried to take this thing over from the hotel. Turns out that guy bites. Don't do that. So, quick question here. Who here, raise your hand if you're a developer or an operations person who writes code for a living. Cool. Who here manages people? Okay. Who here works on the business side of things? Okay. Fairly decent respect. Who here is in operations? Perfect. Good. Always try to figure out who these people are that you're talking to. So let's talk about cloud governance. Two words that are a terrific substitute for Ambien. Whenever you mention that, people fall asleep. I have a toddler at home. Whenever I mention that, she goes to sleep. I'm kidding. She's really super into cloud governance. That's Ahead in the Cloud by Stephen Orban. We're hoping she grows up to become an auditor someday. Yeah, not every day you see someone get on stage and admit to child abuse. So what is cloud governance? It's entirely possible you may never have heard of the term other than from someone trying to sell you something. And surprise, despite the fact that I dress better than a typical developer, I guess, I'm not here to sell you anything. But as manifested in most organizations today, governance tends to cover three generally basic areas. Are we complying with our own policies, with relevant laws, et cetera? Costs should be fairly self-explanatory. So why is your test environment costing us what looks like a telephone number on the bill is always a question businesses like to ask. And risk, of course. So funny story, remember that super expensive test environment that I have and that production environment that you used to have? Well, you'll laugh when this is all over. The problem is that in many companies, as it's manifested today, cloud governance is something of a relic. I'm not saying that it needs to be, but every time I talk to a company, this is how it gets expressed. So let's start by covering, I guess, what an implementation of governance theoretically covers. And you can see this, maybe I'm talking about cloud governance, maybe I'm talking about DevOps, maybe I'm talking about Agile, maybe I'm talking about anything that a management consultant is trying to sell you. It all seems to come back to these three things. And they're boring, but that's the old way of doing things. Let's talk about modern cloud governance here in 2018. In the context of building something new and exciting, of tossing aside the old data center, what is modern cloud governance? Brace yourselves for a revelation. Here we go. Modern cloud governance. That's right. No one cares. If they do care, it isn't really apparent in the way that we've been talking about it, in what we're seeing in various companies. It's not something that's taken particularly to heart. Does anyone here have a good cloud governance program at the company that they work in? And no, at AWS, you're not allowed to raise your hand. Yeah, no one's willing to put themselves out there, and that's generally pretty common. But let's test the theory for a second here. Show of hands here. Who here can say what's currently running in their AWS account without looking at their bill? Okay, a few people. Not much. Oh, just for clarity there, I use AWS account as sort of an analog for cloud, not just because they're a sponsor, but because they actually have customers. On the other end of the spectrum, you have Oracle Cloud. I'm not saying that there aren't Oracle Cloud customers out there, but they're kind of like drop bears. Everyone swears they exist, but I haven't seen one. Sorry, back to topic there. Okay, raise your hand if you accidentally wind up provisioning 10 times too many resources. Will you know before finance tells you? And believe me, finance will tell you loudly. It tends to be an interesting conversation. Last question, then I'll let you stop raising your hands for a while. We'll end the calisthenics for a few minutes. Raise your hand if you would bet your job that nobody is running anything for production in a development account. And no, we don't have a development account is not a valid answer to that. Yeah. The problem is that you wind up with a bunch of old policies that have sort of been forklifted and transplanted whole from the data center days and brought forward into a time of cloud. And this hasn't really improved by the way that most corporate policies tend to come about. This tweet is almost 10 years old, and it's one of those things that I think we can all agree with, and it resonates. None of these approaches and none of these policies came from nothing, but they all follow the same pattern in that something disastrous happens at a company, and the immediate response is to slap a new policy on that. It's the same theory of where we get a whole bunch of stupid warning labels slapped on things. It's, oh, someone did something stupid once, so we're going to have a sign that tells them not to do it again. Good rule of thumb for those of you who raised your hand when I asked if you're managing people out there. If someone asks dangerously or unethically or dishonestly or offensively, it's a job for performance management, not for making policy. Instead of instituting a company-wide don't harass people with an air horn policy, maybe you fire Ted and then the problem goes away. Just a thought there. So let's find the policy equivalents of those warning signs. Now, when you drop in one of these, a cloud environment here, it just seems like that's where the servers moved. Nothing else changes. And we're going to keep our policies intact. And why they're there. The only thing that changed is where the servers live, right? You can treat everything exactly the same way. You're just paying a different company to run your servers. People think that way. It's the idea of lift and shift, where you just take exactly what's running in your data center, drop it somewhere else, and then assume nothing changes. But everything changes. Anyone know what that is? That's right. It's your company's change approval board meeting. You need them all to agree before you're allowed to spin up instances. They meet every 2 weeks. And it's easier for them to say no. If they approve something and then it breaks, they get questioned. No is the default safety response. Uh-oh, now you're in trouble. Someone didn't get approval from a human before their auto-scaling group scaled out. This will be remembered on your performance review. The consequences will be severe. Later, you're going to wonder how things got to this point. That's a painting by Botticelli, by the way. Somewhere in this room, there's an art history major who just sat it bolt upright. No, it's not. But now they're sad because, no, it's a Caravaggio instead. That's right. Your degree is still not the most helpful thing in the world for you. Sorry, art history majors. We're trying. It used to be you could also just throw all this to a vendor, and that's awesome. And the problem is that there's no vendor in this space in a time of cloud. There's more than that. This is a partial snippet from the Cloud Native Computing Foundation's landscape. As of this week, there are 526 vendors that they're tracking. But I'm sure you could always hire one of them to go ahead and handle managing all of the rest. Good luck on that one. Send me a postcard if you ever get there. But I've never found that this is the sort of thing that you can outsource sensibly. So that approach doesn't work. So what do we do instead? How do we start thinking about this? I mean, you could always follow the way of the passive-aggressive weasel and just blame people after the fact for things that didn't work out quite the way you wanted. The problem is that after the fact doesn't work so well when it's been a security breach or a contract violation or your bill is enormous. It's too late. You're effectively fighting an after-action battle at that point. And it's not coming from a place of businesses not knowing what's going on, and it's not coming from people who don't want things to be better. The world is different when you're in cloud. Instead of being able to predict what your expenses are going to be, they vary from month to month. You're treating it almost like a utility. It used to be that in order for a new series of systems to be provisioned, it required the influence of a lot of people. Now a single person can do that before lunchtime. I'm old. I'm just old enough to have started my career in a time of cloud before everything wound up launching. I used to be a grumpy old Unix systems administrator, which is the only kind of Unix systems administrator. So this part of the talk is a little segment I like to call Back in My Day. So roll along with me on this one, and we're going to tell a story about how this whole thing works. Give me this for a few minutes. I've earned it. Back in my day, when you wanted to order a bunch of servers, it took a couple of months for them to show up. And I promise, Dell would not ship you servers before the check cleared. You would have to wire payment if you needed it in a hurry, and then it was down to 2 weeks. And you'd accidentally order an extra server rack approximately never. If you sit down and talk to someone at your company, like, so funny story, I accidentally ordered $2 million of extra servers we didn't need. The response is, that's funny, we accidentally fired you and are now assisting the police with their inquiries because there's no way you're not embezzling. Now they announce a service, and surprise, your bill just did something horrifying. This is a post from almost a year ago, right after reInvent last year. A new service came out called Macy. In short, what it does is it winds up applying machine learning to security logs and looking for weird access patterns, which is great. The problem is that to ingest, it costs $5 per gigabyte. So someone ran this overnight on a $5,000 monthly bill, and surprise, it costs more now. I had a client who was going to run it until they did the math and realized month one would be $76 million. So they went with option B, which was literally anything except that, possibly spinning up a company to do it by hand, then declaring victory and firing everyone. Our amazing startup journey has come to an end. It used to be that if you were accidentally spending $60,000 extra, you were embezzling. Now it's you clicked the wrong button in a console. The world changed. Back in my day, you didn't have a drop-down in a console where a single click away meant that you would pretty much just put your company in the headlines, but you do now. For a long time, this was what the S3 bucket console looked like, where it said any authenticated AWS user. Okay, great, makes sense. Everyone in my company should be able to view this data. What it was not intuitive in this version of the UI was that any AWS user means on the planet, not in your account. And that's why you see S3 bucket leaks showing up again and again and again. This is also why a good lesson in why UX matters. Who knew? It was easy to understand before these days. If you're opening something to the entire network and just the entire internet now has access to your domain controller, you kind of know what you're doing, and it usually takes more than a single click to make that happen. The world changed again. And back in my day, you handled auditors a certain way. It was fun and it was easy back in the days of data centers. I wound up doing a tour in one particular data center for a company I worked at where an auditor had come by. He was a young kid, fresh out of school, was working for a big auditing company, and he asked, as we're walking through the racks, do you have a DR plan? And my response was, let's find out, and I unplugged the switch at the top of the rack. And I don't think I've seen anyone go that pale in my entire life. It was astonishing. Now, yes, I'd sort of planned this, and because we were in the data center, we did what we were supposed to do and routed traffic away from that data center, but we didn't tell him that, and it was fun being able to play that game. And that was great. A few years go by, and I'm doing a similar sort of audit exercise as I work for a company that's doing business with a giant finance company. And if you've never been in the pleasant position of having to deal with large corporate entities, they send you a giant checklist that you're supposed to fill out. And this was in the early days of my cloud exposure. So I didn't answer it with the talk to Amazon that you're supposed to answer it with. I acted like it was just running in a data center. So I filled out all of their questions exactly like I did in years past. And if any of you have ever tried this, you probably know exactly what happened next. They wanted to go take a visit to the AWS data center that I had just finished describing. I know we have a couple of AWS people in the audience. Can I get a tour of US East 1 later this year? Yeah, that's the thing. The answer is always no. Even when you ask people in front of 200 people where they can't possibly say no, they still say no. And it doesn't go well when you have to explain this to a giant finance company. What? Why are they saying no? We're the second largest bank in Albuquerque. Stupid online bookstore. And it becomes a difficult conversation. And of course, back in my day, when you had something new and different and exciting to figure out, you could just slap it onto the end of the job description, and whatever poor bastard you wound up hiring next would find it to be their problem. And this was great when it's must-have experience with LDAP. It's not so great when it talks about building cross-functional governance functions. And oh yeah, did you learn that when you were getting your comp sci degree, right? It turns out that that's not a thing, and this winds up growing beyond the scope of an individual person. Back in my day, the world changed. It really forces an evolution. Evolve or die, dinosaur. You don't wind up in the same places. The time of cloud is really nigh. And now that we're moving away from lift and shift of just taking what lives in a data center and moving it into the cloud, now that the world has changed again, that cloud native is showing up, everything's a bit different. There's no longer a data center analog. If you take a look at all of the stuff that the different cloud providers are releasing, they're becoming much more intelligent in some ways. They're higher level services. If you're building stuff with a bunch of Lambda functions that tie together with and speak to the internet with an API gateway and they talk to DynamoDB on the backside, that doesn't map to what most of us have running in our data centers at all. Cloud native does have an inherent promise to it, but it does require a shift in how we think about it. At reInvent last year, Amazon CTO, Dr. Vogels, got up on stage and said that in the future, all the code you write will be business logic. And that made some sense. This is what's happening as infrastructure slips below the surface, where it goes from something we really need to be acutely aware of to something that is someone else's problem far away in another company. And cloud services are becoming higher level. You're not really spending things on a capital expenditures basis. You're doing it as OpEx now, and it changes the way your business and your executives see these things. You wind up with having to deal with multiple accounts. You wind up being able to spin up enormous piles of resources just with a credit card. There's no diligence process. Anyone who has a corporate credit card now becomes someone who can run their own data center equivalent. That's a change. Of course, that said, you can't take everything he says at face value. Werner says a lot of things. Not all of them necessarily come to pass. I don't know that they're going to be building an AWS 400, but at this point, would anyone bet against them? They're Amazon. Their product strategy is yes. They're probably going to release something that solves all kinds of other nonsense. So as your estate tends to grow in various cloudy type environments, it's important to look forward. It's sort of depressing to end a keynote on an everything is terrible and there's a whole bunch of changes coming, good luck, have fun. It's also sort of depressing to end a keynote less than 20 minutes in. So let's talk a little bit more and see if we can get this a bit more uplifting. I want to share some thoughts around how governance in a cloud native world works. Now, let me be very clear here. I don't guarantee that anything that I'm about to say is going to work in your environment. The conference organizers guarantee that it will. And if it doesn't, remember to blame them for screwing up the speaker selection. The first step, and this is sometimes the biggest one for companies, is to stop viewing this as an engineering problem fundamentally. The days where we could treat this as something that just the technical people have to solve are gone. And I didn't introduce myself but at the beginning of this talk, so now that we're about 43 slides in, let's go ahead and fix that. My name's Quinn. As I mentioned, I have 15 years of experience doing SRE-style work and sysadmin stuff, and these days I wind up doing something a little different. I don't call myself an engineer now. I call myself a cloud economist, 2 words no one can define, so no one argues with me about it. When you're the only one out there, you're automatically the best. Hey, marketing. And what I do functionally day to day is I go into various companies and I fix the horrifying AWS bill. This is a problem that sneaks up on people and it's widespread because of exactly the problems I'm talking about here. That's where this talk came from. Most of what I do as a result, though, looks a lot less like engineering and a lot more like translating between very different groups of people. So I mentioned earlier the stupid generic slide that you'll see something like this in every corporate deck anywhere. This is enterprise-ware. Well, not quite. You need about 800 more words on a slide. Then it's an enterprise-grade slide. But bear with me. Let's go through these in detail here. Let's start with people, because people are the most important thing. You've got to bring them along for the ride. We can't replace them with robots yet. So for those people who are managers here, You don't want your engineers spending a month of effort to save $20 on your monthly cloud bill. Conversely, you absolutely want them to spend a month of effort to save $200,000 a month on your cloud bill. And maybe, and this is a radical idea here, you could tell them that. You'd be amazed how many people don't, because from the engineering side, those two things look an awful lot alike. It's not directly obvious when we're doing an optimization, whether it's material to the business or whether it isn't. And when you tell them that, you've got to tell them that with actions. A bunch of people here wind up working on the engineering side. And I've had client engineers who've saved 5 times what their annual salary was. And not only were they not rewarded for doing that, they wound up dinged on their review because they didn't ship an additional feature. You have to understand something vital here. If you value something, you absolutely have to measure it. Who here gets bonused or promoted or raises based upon saving money for their employer? Yeah, a couple of hands in the back. And yeah, not a lot. But every person here generally works for a company that values that. If you want people to focus on saving money, you've got to wind up doing this in a way that ties back to their KPIs or key performance indicators, or to speak in engineer phrasing, the things that are good on the matrix of do I get promoted or not. If you expect people to optimize for things that you don't expressly tell them to optimize for, and then get upset when they don't do that, I'm afraid to tell you that you're a crap manager. The worst manager I ever had spoke only in metaphor and was surprised when his team did not understand what he was asking for. Spell out what you want people to do. Who here can spin up resources in their company's AWS or equivalent account? Cool. Now keep your hand up if you can spin them up, but you're not allowed to see the bill. That's default, and that's nuts. Fix it. By default, your engineers cannot see what something costs, but then you wind up yelling at them when they spend too much money spinning things up. Am I the only person who thinks that that's ridiculous? This starts to evolve into processes here. What do you wind up changing organizationally to wind up addressing these things? Everyone loves meetings, but this is one of those ones you really want to have. Who here works in finance? Okay, 1 or 2 people. Wow, they let you out. Normally people in finance don't go to conferences, they go to lunch. The trick is as you start building this out, get finance and engineering speaking to one another. Historically, they didn't have to communicate more, but as the entire business gets tied more inextricably to things that vary minute to minute, that has to change. You speak different languages, but working together is one of those things that has to be addressed. And if people don't show up to the governance meeting, hunt them down. This can't be an optional thing. As you spin out environments, the idea of keeping everything in a single AWS account, which is what they suggested about 5 years ago, starts to fall apart. Now there's an idea of breaking things up into different organizations. Not only does that separate out billing from an attribution perspective, but it limits the blast radius. So if one of your business units causes a problem, it doesn't take the entire company down. You might also consider, and this is radical here, letting finance weigh in on what those accounts should be and how they wind up tying back. Here's a hint. They're probably going to align with different cost centers or entities that appear in the company's P&L. It sounds like it's an engineering question. It's kind of not. A lot of migration stories and guides focus on the idea of building an internal cloud center of excellence. The idea has a lot of merit behind it, but holy shit, don't call it that. If you say, I work in the cloud center of excellence, you're about to learn that you were not bullied nearly enough in high school, because compared to what's about to happen to you, it's not going to be pretty. I mean, what does this wind up saying as well? Oh, I'm in the cloud center of excellence. What is someone supposed to say to that? I'm in the data center of mediocrity? That doesn't really work very well, and it sets up an us versus them mentality that's really unhelpful. The idea of having we learned this thing as we migrated into the cloud in our department, let's share it with the rest of the company, is awesome. Naming things is an art. Find someone who's better at it. And now let's talk about tools. Did he just call the entire audience tools? Yeah, a little bit. This is a technical conference. So let's talk about some tooling ideas that make this a little bit less of a hellscape. This is less about specific tools of grab this code and do this thing, and more about outcomes that start to matter. And it generally tends to start with guardrails. If you want to wind up having sensible guardrails in place, like, for God's sake, don't use Macy, it'll send the company into bankruptcy, that's a good example. So is, how do we keep people technically from being able to build an open S3 bucket that the entire world can access? That's good stuff. And there's other things that start getting a bit more into the weeds too. For example, in AWS, if I want to spin up an instance, I can spin up an instance that costs less than a penny an hour, and I can spin instances that cost $43 an hour. And one of those is called a T3 instance, and the other one is called a P3 instance. Amazon employees, take note. You know how I said that naming things is an art? Yeah, maybe you could have the warning this is expensive label on something like that. But you also have to get out of the way and not explicitly block people from doing everything they want to do, or you give rise to the whole idea of shadow IT. You don't want people to just, because again, if everyone has a corporate credit card and you have a bunch of obnoxious process around your stuff, it's not that hard to wind up spinning up something new. And to that end, I like the idea of a special developer account. I've seen this in a few large enterprises now, where you can spin up as a developer anything you want in this account. But 7, 14, or 21 days later, it's going to be turned off automatically and destroyed. So you have the freedom to experiment and do all kinds of interesting things, but you aren't going to have any lasting damage to the company where, oops, I kept a petabyte hanging around for the last 8.5 years. Sorry about that. It winds up building to a model where the governance happens in the background. Then you can promote things into a permanent account with a gated process, but it also keeps out of the way of developers. Another thing to consider is the idea of tagging. Nobody really tags anything in cloud, but those tags are what cost analytics are all based on. And at best, you might get someone to tag the instance that they spun up. And that's great, but that tag only applies to the instance, not the data volume attached to it, not the internet gateway that it's talking to, not the snapshots of its various volumes, not the S3 objects that it's writing and accessing. So you capture a small piece of it and everything else just sort of gets dropped. You're never going to get a human to be able to do that, so there's got to be something that automates this stuff. Asking people to do it by hand is just not practical in this type of environment. And you have to automate it. Don't bother and yell at people to do it by hand, or this properly tagged wolf will bite you in the face. Chatbots are also not a terrible idea if implemented properly. That's right, Clippy for the cloud. Look, everything old is new again, and it's awful. But it's great to have something like this pop up in Slack or the equivalent. Hey, it looks like your developer cluster number 4 is currently costing the gross domestic product of Belize. Are you still using it, or would you like to turn it off? Yes or no. If you hit yes, it turns it off. If you hit no, it keeps it around and nags you again in a week. If you ignore it, it keeps bugging you for a day or two and then turns it off for you. The idea of automation turning into this stuff is awesome. And it also keeps individuals from having to do this. Because nobody is going to go out of their way to turn things off. I mean, I wind up, as mentioned, my entire business is built around saving money on AWS. And I'm pretty decent at it. My personal bill is about $30 a month. Except last month when it was 50, because I wound up spinning up something to do a demo. I forgot that VPC endpoints cost per hour, and at the end of the month, I left 5 of them running, and oops, and I felt stupid, and I turned them off. It's easy to do even when you're thinking about this stuff, and blaming people isn't helpful. And there's always the question here of how do we wind up restricting people to do things? And the answer, and this is controversial, but maybe you don't. People generally tend to live up or down to expectations you hold for them. And if you treat people like children, they often act like children. Maybe instead of saying you can't do this, you wind up with a tracking system that looks at who winds up spinning what up and then adding it against a budget. And when someone's budget exceeds a certain point, then it's time to have a conversation with them. I have clients who do this, but it's not perfect. I mean, at the beginning of the month, you wind up with a finance person who's turned white again, kicking the door off the hinges and screaming, okay, we're looking at the users who are spinning shit up, and holy crap, who the hell is Jenkins? Jenkins gets fired. Yeah, when you have something that spins up all of your production environments and that's who it gets assigned to, you have to communicate this. Again, different languages. Okay, something else. When we talk about the idea of having someone come in and tell people that they're spending too much or they exceed that, if you're going to badger people, hire an actual badger. It's a lot more humane. You don't want to make it someone's job to nag people. The entire reason that cloud is the future, that we all are either in the cloud or are moving to the cloud, is not the reason people think it is. We talk about capability, but back in the early days of cloud, there were serious concerns here. There were cost concerns, there were security concerns, there were compliance concerns across the board. So why did people move to the cloud? Because they didn't have to deal with the surly asshole in central IT who said no all the time. And as soon as you play that game in a cloud environment, you wind up going right back to where you started. Don't backslide. So we covered a fair bit of ground there. Cloud native is really changing even the idea of legacy cloud concepts around now. When you get away from VMs or instances, that's great. Now you're looking at container workloads, and it becomes very difficult to do attribution in traditional ways. It changes the nature of things. You wind up with serverless, where you just get paid for invocation time, where something runs for 200 milliseconds and turns off. First, it's super hard to be able to track that down. On the other side, though, if you start tying that back to the actual part of your application that it's running on and what it's chunking on, suddenly you're able to map the capital flow through your organization and see exactly what every part of your pipeline is costing. That's a visibility at a granularity we never had before, but the old ways of governing it don't work. And the time to talk about this is meow. Hey, I'm waiting for I'll talk to put that one in there. The time is to start talking about this as engineers is meow, before the business starts inflicting it on you in ridiculous, regressive ways. It's worth mentioning that this is a journey, it's not a destination. A lot of this isn't going to directly apply to your company until you start scaling out in the cloud and hit success. That's generally measured in years, not days or weeks. And by the time you get there, the questions and the governance that are going to be imposed upon you are going to be tremendously challenging to implement with what you've built unless you think about this while you're building. If you build an idea towards this is what the service is going to be charged against, this is how we're going to build things in the future, that's great. A few small changes that you make today will make your future job a lot easier. The future developer who has to work on this could very well be you. He didn't say this, but he should have. Thank you. My name's Quinn. I do a few things. Thank you, appreciate that. Yeah, I do a few things. I'm a cloud economist. I write a snarky newsletter called Last Week in AWS that gathers all the news from Amazon's ecosystem, strips out the marketing fluff that no one cares about, takes what's left and makes fun of it. They love me. I also have a podcast called Screaming in the Cloud that's a little bit less sarcastic and goes well. Thank you, LatencyConf, and thank you, Perth, for having me.